Alrighty. Let's start. Yeah, good morning, colleagues and students. This is Hayes of School of Fashion and Textile, and I'm co-facilitating this seminar with Professor Ginny Tan, Professor in Fashion and Textile Design in SFT. And welcome to the SFT Distinguished Research Seminar series on fashion design, business, and technology. And the seminar is co-organized with Research Center of Textile for Future Fashion and Joint Research Center for Fiber Innovations and Renewable Materials. And the seminar today situates in the scope of fashion theory and history, yet it concerns interdisciplinary issues in the fashion world. Today, we are honored and glad to have Professor Hazel Clark to share with us her slow approach to fashion. Professor Clark is Professor of Design Study and Fashion Study at Parsons Schools of Design, the New School at New York, where she established the MA Fashion Study program and the former MA Design Study program. She is an international recognized scholar, teacher, curator, and collaborator, whose project covered textile history, theory, fashion in Hong Kong and China, fashion curating, and fashion in everyday life. And most recently, the slow approaches to fashion. Professor Clark's interest in the role that fashion and dress play across time and cultures includes research on the Cheongsam, undertaken when she was a professor in School of Design here in PolyU. And the talk today is based on Professor Clark's upcoming books titled Slow, to be published in May this year as a part of the Fashion in Action series of short books on global issues in fashion. The series calls on reader to become active participants in the future of fashion world, set against a backdrop of massive waste, intensive energy consumption, human exploitation, and overconsumption of fast fashion. The approach Slow offers a thoughtful, practical, and sustainable approach to fashion, speaking to a more mindful, caring, and humanitarian attitude and practices. So drawing on good fashion practices and ideas from around the world, the books and this talk advocates that engagement with a slow approach to fashion can offer a more sustainable future for all of us. So we will first have the talk by Professor Clark, and then we will have a discussion session later. So if you have any questions and ideas that you would want to discuss with Professor Clark and everybody, please type in the chat box, and then we will look into them together. Okay, so without further ado, let me pass the time to Professor Clark. Professor Clark, please.
Thanks so much, Hayes. Thank you, and thank you, Professor Tan, for inviting me, and good morning to you all. It's nice to be with students in Hong Kong again, even though I'm talking to you from a cold and snowy New York City. So I'm just going to hopefully share my screen and we'll get off to a start. You can see that okay? Good. So what I'm talking about today is an approach to sustainable fashion, which might be unfamiliar to you, but it's offered as a way of thinking about sustainability in fashion, even if you don't necessarily agree with what I'm saying. And it very much comes from my personal background, which is in the history, theory, and culture of fashion and of design. So just a little bit first about where I've come from and some of my ideas have come from. So as Professor said, I was working at the PolyU and researching in Hong Kong during the 1990s when I wrote this little book on the Cheongsam, on which there really wasn't much written on the Cheongsam then, and certainly not in English, which looked at the history of the Cheongsam, but more importantly, its role, its cultural significance in Hong Kong as an item of dress. And at the same time, I was working, that was published in 2000, I was working on another book, an anthology with a colleague, which was published in 2005 on secondhand clothes. which looked at the history, culture, economics, and present-day state of secondhand clothes and secondhand fashion. And I contributed a chapter on secondhand fashion in Hong Kong in the 1990s, which was really at the late 90s when secondhand was just starting to appear in Hong Kong. But I'm saying both of these because I am interested generally and in relationship to what I'm talking to you about this morning in fashion related to culture, but also related to the everyday and the ordinary, not just to high fashion. More recently, I've co-edited the book On the Left about fashion and everyday life, an anthology, a collection of essays talking about all sorts of aspects of America as a landmass, but also different peoples who live here and how they express themselves and their identities through what they wear. And you can certainly look that up. That followed in concept a book I co-authored with my friend and colleague Cheryl Buckley in 2017, looking at fashion and everyday life in London and New York from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of this century. So again, thinking about the role of fashion in the everyday and in relationship to ordinary people. But more specifically for this talk, the foundation of this work was actually an article I wrote for the journal, was published in the Journal of Fashion Theory, actually a long time ago now, in 2008, which was devoted to what was then called eco-fashion. And this is some comments which I think you can read by the editor of the journal, Regina Root, who talked about eco-fashion as a celebration and talked about it in relationship to self-awareness, ingenuity, empowerment. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. And also relative or contextualized by the world, the wider world, aspects such as climate change and the global decline in biodiversity. So again, thinking about fashion relative to not just itself, but to expressions of individuals and what was going on in the world. I published an article in this journal which was called Slow Plus Fashion. I'll come back to this shortly, but please notice I'm not talking about slow fashion. I'm talking about slow plus fashion. So that's not just a semantic thing, but I will tell you more about that in a moment. But basically, to synthesize this article, these were the three key points which really provided the skeleton for this article. Thinking about local resources and distributed economies, and I used quite a lot of examples. You can read the article, you can get a hold of it. Transparency of production and less intermediation in the system, and products which had longer usable lives and really appealed to human senses. And then much more recently, I've revisited this work for this little book, which will be published in a couple of months' time, which takes the question of what if we looked at slow as an ethical strategy for practicing fashion in all sorts of ways, designing, but also wearing fashion, rather than thinking about slow fashion, as we often use that term, as another fashion movement. And as Professor Ng just said, this is again set against wider context of what's going on in the world, but also what's going on in the fashion system and some of the concerns that have been bubbling up around that. But to contextualize, I'm sorry, to contextualize what I'm saying a little bit more, I started just to look back at, in effect, where we are in fashion today in many ways, which is in this space where fashion seems to be getting faster and faster, or seems to have become faster and faster in terms of how it's produced and how it's being consumed. And I'll tell you a bit more about what I mean about that. If we look, for example, at this interesting book by the journalist Terry Agons, the American journalist Terry Agons, which was published at the very end of the last century, It documents the rise of large-scale fashion brands in the 1990s and looked at this as a major change in the global fashion industry, where fashion became more ubiquitous, or if you like, more democratized, available to more people, but also by the same token became somewhat, she argues, homogenized. So became more available to more people, but became more the same in the process in the 1990s. Aggins talks about the rise of the brands, and here we have one example of the Italian Benetton, which became a global brand in the late 80s and 90s. And I remember it, well, when I was in Hong Kong having a presence there, for example. But the interesting thing about Benetton and other companies, but this was one of the first, was its rapid communication system within itself. In other words, the rapidity of getting information from the sales floor back to the hub of manufacturing. So this pretty tight loop between consumption and production. Added to which, having a very distinctive, and in the case of Benetton, sometimes controversial advertising strategy, which manifested often on very large billboards in major cities around the world. But the point here being that this rapidity of production was also very much linked to the development of identity of fashion brands. And it was branding that started in the 1990s to become a form of product differentiation for the first time. In 1989, the New York Times coined the term fast fashion when the brand Zara opened in Manhattan. And also, this article refers to another brand, Express, which was a division of the US company, the Limited, but used this term to define brands which had rapid product turnover and low prices. So brought product to market relatively very quickly at low prices with rapid turnover. So developing this Benetton model for the first time by the end of the 20th century. Some nicknamed it McFashion because, like McDonald's, it had a global reach, it had speed of production, it played into a consumer increasing desire for instant gratification, as with fast food. It was mass produced, it was standardized, it had low prices. Another innovation, which in this same trajectory, which began at the beginning of the current century, was collaborations between fast fashion brands, particularly H&M to begin with, and high-end brands. The first example for H&M of these very advantageous collaborations was with Karl Lagerfeld when he was at Chanel in 2004, who produced a capsule collection for H&M, which set this whole high-low initiative very much on its feet. But also at the time, Lagerfeld observed very perceptibly that the future will only be about high and low. Everything in between will disappear. And I think that's something really to think about in terms of how we think about fashion today. Certainly when we're thinking about designer brands and then what we probably still call fast fashion brands. And then building upon that, of course, online shopping in the 21st century, which has had such a huge impact. But again, with this assumption with it that we can see now and buy now. So shortening conceptually and actually that time between a garment being designed, being produced, and coming to not necessarily the shop floor, coming to the screen and being purchased. So added to which online shopping really sells garments, accessories, whatever, based entirely on how they look, with the purchasers knowing little or nothing of how the garments are made, what their materials are, or whether the sleeves are sewn into the garment sufficiently well, etc., etc. So a huge change in thinking about fashion and how we buy it and where we buy it. Terry Aggins again actually commented based on this that Gen Xers born in the 1970s were brought up to dress casually and were unable to discern any quality in clothes because of this lack of familiarity with materials. Again, you might not agree with that, and you might not agree with that for your own generation, but it is interesting how our perceptions of how we shopped for fashion and what fashion was and how we encountered it was changing and has changed very, very rapidly since the end of the last century in ways that are much more rapid than fashion changed for the whole of the 20th century. But again, maybe we can come back to that. So cheaper clothes became more widely available, but with a cost. So one of the costs, as I'm calling it, as I've just alluded to, was this disconnection from material garments. And if we think again, taking this, online relationship to buying clothes or to encountering clothes, to one particular example, which I'm using here, and there are many others, and this is quite an old one now, but the beginning of the shopping hall around 2008, which took advantage of the growing impact of moving image, of YouTube, later of TikTok, etc., etc. And hauling not being really about clothes to wear, but actually about the haulers just showing vast quantities of garments, showing them to really, in some case, make their careers, but certainly showing them as a form of entertainment, spectacle, but certainly not in terms of thinking about material clothes to be worn on bodies. And in fact, it's interesting if we think about this notion of the spectacle. In 1967, the French theorist Guy Debord famously talked about the society of the spectacle, a society he was projecting where representation really takes over from lived experience. And we could, speculate that that may be exactly where we are now. But again, something else maybe to think about. But thinking about the sign and image and the importance of the sign and image over substance, if you like, I was interested with this this advert from Temu not so long ago, a couple of years ago, less than 2 years ago, where a pair of faux fur boots, which looked a lot like a branded item, which I'm sure we can recognize the brand, was being sold or not sold for $0. This obviously being an incentive scheme, but the way that the cost of what the cost of an item is almost so relative nowadays. It's actually it's a sort of floating it's a floating thing. What items do cost and should cost in terms of monetary value is very, very difficult to ascertain. And this goes across, I think, the fashion spectrum. But added to which, if you're paying or not paying $0 or not very many dollars for an item, it could be argued that you don't actually value it very much. And there's some evidence, a lot of evidence, that fashionable garments are just not being valued in terms of being considered items that consumers, wearers really want to keep with them, really want to keep with them for more than a very short period of time. And the evidence of this comes, for example, in terms of the vast amount of material waste that we know is being produced and distributed across the world. And I'm sure none of this, of course, is unfamiliar to you, but it's interesting just to, focus on it. One example, for example, being the Kantamanto market in Accra in Ghana, which is the largest used clothing market in West Africa, where the clothes which reach it are not just used clothes, but also new clothing, often with tags, which are being shipped particularly from North America, the United Kingdom, Europe, Australia. and have come to be known as dead white men's clothes because it was assumed by local people that these clothes, these unused clothes, must actually be the clothes of people who are deceased. Because, I mean, nobody throws away clothes that are not worn. And in fact, this term dead white men's clothes was also used for the title of a documentary about the market and this whole issue, which was made in Australia in 2021. If you want to look that up, or you may have seen it already. But also the interesting point about clothes being shipped off to Africa from Western countries is very much also part of a colonial-based mindset of just sending stuff somewhere and not really worrying about where it goes. And I think, you're probably the same as I am. When I donate clothes to various facilities to take, my used clothes, I don't really know where they're going. I hope they're going to other people to use, but the fear is they may just be ending on this huge pile of clothes in Accra or elsewhere. So that's one consequence of really us having, as human beings, certainly westernized human beings, more clothes than we actually need, and that excess being promoted by the fashion system. Another consequence, which I think we again know far too well, has been the human waste involved in the production of fashion. And this being the most, I think, tragic recent, but not the only recent manifestation, which was the Rana Plaza clothing factory disaster in Bangladesh 12, 13 years ago, which was killed. Well, you can see the statistics, you probably know them. And also pointing out the fact that most of those killed, as in the famous Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York City at the beginning of the 20th century, most of them were women, women workers, because obviously the global textile industry really does rely substantially, not exclusively by any means, but substantially on women workers. So the consequences of production also happening in certain parts of the globe, and of course this includes in Vietnam, it's included in China, included in Eastern European countries, but being produced in one part of the globe substantially, or parts of the globe, and then shipped to other parts of the globe to be consumed, that introduction of distance between production and consumption. Now, here I'm obviously paraphrasing. I mean, it's a crude representation, but nevertheless, there is truth to that. But that sense of distancing also adds to this sense of dislocation, and also this sense of, if you like, lack of responsibility in terms of who is producing clothes, how clothes are being produced, and questions like, why I can buy a t-shirt for $5 or 60 Hong Kong dollars or whatever. And, does that low price actually have any implication, which of course it does, on who's actually producing the clothes and the conditions in which they're working. So that's one just little context about, maybe where we are, or for a lot of people, where we are in terms of fast fashion. And I'm not saying that, fast fashion does not fulfill a fashion desire and need for many people, but I'm just saying that, there are consequences which, perhaps of course, and we can think about. But now I just want to turn around a little bit more and think about this concept of slow, which I'm interested in, and where that actually came from. And where I'm tracing it back to in this book, certainly, is to the environmental movement, which started in Western countries in the 1960s, or substantially so in terms of a trajectory we can trace to the current day. And if you don't know it, I would recommend you this book, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which is often cited as the starting point of the environmental movement in terms of literature, certainly. Carson was a marine biologist, American marine biologist, who sort of stumbled into, through her research, into a concern about the use of pesticides, and particularly at that time, a pesticide which has now been banned called DDT, which was being used for crop spraying to, so the crops would effectively produce more, the land would produce more. But the consequences were that the pesticide was also lethal, proved lethal to human beings. But at the time she was writing, she was also pointing out how it was lethal to birds, to animals. So the silent spring to which she refers was actually a moment she'd conceived when there would be no noise, there would be no birds, no animals of spring because they'd all been destroyed by pesticides. So this book is just like the beginning of the sort of post Second World War interest in, I mean, which was stimulated with the counterculture movement in America, in Britain, etc., but also with this, a variety of concerns around the environment. And I'm saying this recognizing that, of course, in Hong Kong, in China, the context was very, very different. And I'm speaking very much consciously from a Euro-American perspective at the moment. Another happening, if you like, in 1972, so just a few years later, was this very large international conference, which again is a marker of conversations in the Western world around the environment, which was held in Stockholm in Sweden. It was called Only One Earth, and I think this was also important to recognize not just the importance of acknowledging the earth, but acknowledging that, how human beings are all connected. We all live on the same planet. And also, it was only 3 years after the first moon landing, sorry, the first moon landing, which meant that, for the first time ever, we could see ourselves, the Earth, as you can see here. So this sense of coming together, this sense of connections, this sense of also preserving the Earth and nature was very much in the air, in writing, in conversation in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in a wider sense in the Earth. And also then the terminologies were somewhat different, and they have changed across the decades since the 1960s. And I note there a rather interesting book, which has just been recently republished, which is actually a dictionary, gives us this dictionary of changing terminologies. So the one I'm interested in, slow, which I'll come on to, is part of this trajectory of thinking ethically, sustainably, environmentally. We're using different terms, but of this more conscious way of living and thinking about nature, the earth, one another, our interconnections, which for me is being identified through the use of this term and this concept of slow. So back to the article that I mentioned a moment ago. So the first one I mentioned was on which really introduced this concept of slow plus fashion in 2008. And then more recently, I wrote this article in a journal, another academic journal called Fashion Practice, which was also thinking about the particular contribution of women in fashion, but women in these slower or more focused initiatives. And I don't have time now to give you some examples. You're welcome to read the articles. But this certainly included the fact that when I was looking at certain fashion businesses or designers, which tended to be small scale or using handwork or more localized or having less intermediation between production and consumption, many of them were organizations run by women or where women had quite a large responsibility in various aspects of the process. So that's what led me down that path. But I'll let you follow that up if you'd like. But making the point again, as I did a moment ago with Rana Plaza. I mean, if one's talking about fashion in the world in time across culture, then when women do figure largely as wearers, as producers, etc., etc. But as I say, you can follow that up if you'd like to. But more particularly, this concept of slow comes from the slow food movement, which was begun in Italy in 1986 to promote not literally eating or cooking slowly, but actually to promote traditional and regional cuisine, local ecosystems, and also the pleasure of nourishment and the nourishing effect of food. So tradition, local, and just the pleasure and enjoyment of eating, of that experience. I the article was initiated more particularly by a conference I attended in 2006 in Milan, which brought together representatives from the slow food movement and designers and design educators, theorists, thinkers to really share ideas, which was very fulfilling, but also reminds us of how, we can take ideas and models from outside of ourselves, and they can be very, very, very valuable, whatever that, whatever our initiative is. The idea of slow so started in slow food, but then infiltrated to other areas. We can talk about slow cities. There's a slow city movement, and certainly moved beyond Italy as a concept for food and more widely. For example, in 1996, the Czech author Milan Kundera talked in this fictional account, used the concept of slowness to talk about balance, and which is sometimes expressed in music as exact time or at the right speed. So that's something that I'm much more drawn to, this notion of slow enabling us to think about achieving balance. There have been many since then, there have been many books, and there are many books, podcasts, videos, TikToks on slow. But many encourage us to live better. So, not so much about living better, not faster, not so much just about living, slowing down literally, but actually thinking about the quality of our lives. And this equally applies to thinking about fashion. Of course, the pandemic slowed us all down, slowed down our lifestyles, slowed down our attitudes to what we wore, encouraged us to dress comfortably, encouraged us to dress for screens. Like I'm now, I'm respectably dressed here, but you have no idea what I'm wearing on my feet or below my waist, and I'm not going to tell you. But you got the point. I mean, you were younger, but certainly around. So this notion of also how, wider wider things in the world impact our lives, impact fashion. On this case, in a very kind of everyday normative level. But also the fashion production system was impacted during the pandemic. It slowed down the global supply chain. And actually, I like this image because this to me encapsulates that whole slowing down when in 2021, this huge tanker ran aground in the Suez Canal, blocking the whole canal, which I think is like a metaphor, although it was actually a real thing, about how the global supply chain really does move stuff about. We talk about it, but when you see, and as you can see very accessibly, I know in Hong Kong, in the harbors, these huge tankers. But the almost the craziness sometimes of just moving things around the world and the way that we do that. And this certainly is the case, of course, not just for fashion, but fashion is very much subject to this, movement between place of manufacture and consumption, very simply, and in a more complex way than that. Again, of which you're all very much aware. So also thinking about how slow has had an impact on research into fashion. In 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, Turkish academic, designer, writer Şolan Kipoz published this book, and there are two versions, one in English, one in Turkish, which is a collection of essays which look at a lot of different ways of thinking about slowness and fashion. And it's one of the few books on this topic, exclusively on this topic. Might not be easy to find, but if you don't know it, it's certainly very valuable and covers a range of different approaches from looking at time, upcycling, craft, economic models. So it's well worth uh, finding and looking at. Kate Fletcher, a British academic who's worked a lot on this concept of slow and done a lot of empirical research, has done research on just looking at garments, their lifespan, their use value, how they're worn, how they're laundered, how human beings feel about garments. And these are some basis of some research on just a couple of garments, where people tell the stories around garments and why they like them and why they kept them and why they, the garment on the right, for example, went out of fashion and then came into fashion again. So really, Kate Fletcher, but there's been a number of other researchers, sometimes under the auspices of this area of research called wardrobe studies, who've really studied our relationships with clothing, our practical relationships, but also our emotional relationships. And here is Kate Fletcher doing some of the research she did internationally a few years ago, where she was interviewing subjects with garments. But I just want to point out that she cautioned and has cautioned, as I do, against using this term slow fashion. And this is also why I separate fashion with this and slow with a plus sign, because I'm not wanting to promulgate a new form of branding in fashion, neither does she, but a way of thinking about fashion, which is a more sustainable way of thinking and doing fashion, which also folds in creativity and folds in individual expression. And if you want to look more at this research project, these Lifelines research project that Kate does, it's published in this book, the bottom here, called The Craft of Use, which also argues, as do other scholars, for degrowth or less growth or no growth in fashion, that we don't need basically to produce more clothes. We have enough. We just need to use them in interesting ways, creatively, etc., etc. I also wanted to introduce you to this notion of slow being represented as a disruptive aesthetic in fashion. And I'll explain what I mean now. It's a concept I've taken from someone else, but I just want to explain that a little bit. So if we think, for example, and these are very well known, of course, of the work of the Japanese designers in the 1980s, Kawakubo, Yohji Yamamoto, Issey Miyake, and many others subsequently, what they were doing was producing an aesthetic which was very unfamiliar then in Western fashion, which was comparable in the 1980s to someone like Giorgio Armani, for example. They were producing an aesthetic also which valued the idea of aging and patina and wear. And although, of course, the Kawakubo garment outfit on the right was effectively new, it had that sense of being old and tattered. And we might compare it to the Japanese tradition of boro, this tradition of repairing and patching. But I would say that these ways of fashioning or making clothes can, in retrospect, be considered to be slow. They weren't striving for the new, they weren't striving for perfection, and they weren't, trying to look industrial and perfect. And I'm sorry I'm rushing through this, but I think these will be examples, of course, Similarly with Yoji, thinking about the cloth, thinking about wrinkles and puckers and tears, and thinking and advocating listening to cloth, really taking the reference from material, which of course is very familiar in a cultural sense to Japanese culture. And then finally is say, with lots of designs, but here thinking about his use of pleats and the Please series and how that was referring back to the garments of the Italian Mariano Fortuny at the beginning of the 20th century. But also the kind of slight irony that Issei was using, and the brand is using polyester for Pleats Please, and polyester being one of those materials that is often outlawed today because it is a petroleum-based material and it's not natural, but reminding us that, of course, we can keep a polyester garment forever, and they could outlive us, but that does give, potentially gives garments a longevity and gives a life, which is actually very, very sustainable. And then also thinking just about the style and the design and reminding ourselves about, for example, and I'm sorry, this is a rather silly cartoonish image, but it makes the point about Asian modes of dressing, East Asian modes of dressing, very different from Western modes of dressing, to do with wrapping the body in cloth. And also, for example, how wrapping a kimono or wrapping a garment from many different cultures and places in Southeast and in East Asia is a very slow process. So thinking slowly is about rethinking, is about rethinking fashion, is about rethinking what we mean about sustainability and how we achieve it. Also, following from the Japanese designer Martin Margiela and the Antwerp Six in the late 1980s and beyond, referencing the clothes of workers, everyday clothes, the tabi shoes, which Margiela made famous and seemed to become famous yet again in recent times, but referencing the clothes of workers in Japan. So how everyday practices have been valuable and can be valuable to how we think about what we wear. Margiela also, in this collection, 1991, took some old ball gowns and overdyed them all the same color, introducing a process that we've later come to call upcycling. So the avant-garde in the late 20th century were actually introducing ways of doing fashion to produce garments which actually had longevity, which could be worn certainly for a long time and still, make the wearer look very much or be very much of the moment and in the moment if that's what they wanted. Margiela's sweater, designed from old army socks, which were cut up and sewn back together, also demonstrates how designers can introduce wearers to practices rather than just to products, and can be instrumental in attitude shifts in terms of thinking more sustainably or thinking slower. And then just one final set of examples about how we think about what fashion is and how we think about how we wear our clothes, why we wear our clothes, what they do, how they communicate, which of course they do always. I mean, absolutely always. So some historical examples, thinking about, for example, how fashion has been used as protest. The suffragettes, the beginning of the 20th century in the UK and America, women who wanted to get the vote, who wanted to get the democratic vote, who adopted a particular form of dress, wore white dresses, and I'm sorry, this is in not a color photograph, but were wearing them with green and purple sashes. And actually these white dresses have been recently, or white dresses, white suits have been recently picked up by female politicians, particularly in the United States, which is quite interesting how, that's been seen still to be very significant. And then even further back of the French Revolution, the women who were making these red liberty caps or bonnet rouge, who were sitting next to the guillotine as the French revolutionaries were executed, these liberty caps as a symbol of freedom, of liberation, which is another historical example which actually was in a way reinvigorated quite recently during the first election of President Trump, when the protests against his election women were wearing these so-called pussy hats. And if you don't understand that context, again, you can look it up. But these hats were being self-made by women. Patterns were being shared online. They were very easy to make. And they also, as with the revolutionary red hats, they brought back the slow craft of knitting, which has also itself been revived in recent years as a form of craft activism. So as a form of identifying with a group of people, with producing something symbolically significant. We can also say producing a fashion, but something that was very easy to wear, but also politically very powerful. And also a couple more examples in France in 2018, when there were a lot of demonstrations over the economy. What was chosen to bring people together were these gilets jaunes, the yellow vests that French people have to wear, have to carry in their cars for sake of emergency. So this way that the sort of quotidian, no, this isn't high fashion, but it is a way of showing the power of what we wear and the power of what we wear as a form of communication and of bringing people together. And of course, similarly in Hong Kong in 2014 with the yellow umbrellas, and they're significant at that moment in time. The final theme that I want to just speak to very briefly, and I've come to, and it's one of many themes I've come to through doing the work for this book, but I don't have time to introduce them, but is the way that slow can also be aligned to caring through fashion, and how care and caring is actually something important to think about on all sorts of level in relationship to what we wear. As a result of the Rana Plaza disaster, two women in the UK, Carrie Sommers and Ursula de Castro, started the fashion revolution, which continues today. And again, you probably know about this, but basically asked who made my clothes. So drew attention to the fact that the clothes that many people in westernized countries are wearing are made by anonymous, usually female workers in another part of the world who are very badly paid, not necessarily working in good conditions. So it is possible to, find out and identify who these people are, but certainly acknowledge that they exist. Caring for clothes is another way of thinking about care. Kate Sekules is a journalist, a PhD student in New York, but also a visible mender with 30,000 followers on Instagram. You can find her. She's called Dr. Mend. I'm sorry, I've forgotten her Instagram handle. Wrote this book a few years ago, but just again, showing the popularity of mending, not just to invisibly mend and disguise something that is broken, but actually as a creative form of caring for clothes, which has been popular recently. And in the fashion system, the fashion media, in the context of in the United States, Black Lives Matter, for a moment, certainly American fashion magazines acknowledged a wider narrative for fashion. And this is a picture of someone who was, well, you can read the caption, but as a form in the United States of historical retribution. So the way that the fashion system can and might care through media. Or differently, the first issue of Vogue Scandinavia featured Greta Thunberg as the voice of a generation, which was bringing together concerns about climate activism, but also the relationship to mainstream fashion. And then finally, also, you may know this collective, the Research Collective for Decoloniality in Fashion, but an interesting fashion research group that exists virtually of scholars, academics, professionals, artists around the globe, and particularly outside of the global north, thinking about a wider discourse for fashion, which is not just centered in the Western capitalist model, but I would also say is evidence of slower and more caring and ethical approaches through their work to fashion as a whole. So to sum up, So where do we go from here? Well, again, very briefly and very quickly, in terms of my slow approach to fashion, I'm finding that concept helpful because it just enables a way of thinking really outside of the mainstream fashion system, thinking about practices, not just products, thinking about the notion of fashion not just being exclusively concerned with the new, thinking about fashion being about material clothes, not just about images, thinking about what would happen if we had fewer garments, had fewer garments in our closets, fewer garments were produced. Thinking about fashion representing choice rather than mandate, something that we create as individuals, not brands tell us. And thinking about fashion as being about communication and collaboration and agency, especially to women. So a call for action. So that's the way I end this. And this is a very small book. It's 8 by 5. It's a small paperback. But I end this book, and the books in this series all end with calls to action. And these are just some of the calls to action. There are 30 of them, I think, at the back of the book. But something for the readers just to say, these are things which you maybe can think about doing or sharing or talking about as a way of thinking about and maybe moving forward with this often very troubling notion of how we sustain fashion or what sustainable fashion is. And as Professor Ng said at the beginning, this book is part of a new series that comes out this May. There's the QR code. It's one of 3 that will be out in May. They're small books, each has one topic, one word as its title and a particular topic. And there will be more in the series. I'm co-editing the series, so this is really exciting. But they're all basically trying to think about how we take action around some of the issues that concern fashion, concern us all globally, and how we move them forward, or if not move them forward, at least, discuss them. So with that, thank you very much for listening. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be very pleased to try and answer them.